Hey, please welcome Dave Allen.
Okay, so if you're anything like me, and I probably hope for most of your sake that you're not, you probably spend most of your coding time working on applications, where you've got a fairly straightforward kind of workflow about how you go about doing certain things. And I mean, that's what I do, obviously. But I recently fell down the rabbit hole of trying to, write libraries and things like that, and I found some interesting changes in the sort of workflow involved. And so I thought I would share some of my learnings tonight with you. So basically, I'm just going to start with suppose that you wanted to write a gem. Now, I'm not going to go into exactly how to write a gem, because if you want that, you can ask Pat to give another one of his excellent How to Write a Gem talks. Sorry? March, excellent. Okay, so there you go, come back in March. So we're doing it backwards, right? We're going to do the what to do once you've written your gem thing first, and then we're going to do how to write a gem later. It's good. But so we'll assume you've written your gem or you're writing a gem, and you want your gem to work across as many versions of Ruby as possible, because you don't know what version of Ruby your users are tied to. And we'll also suppose that your gem depends upon other gems. Again, because it's difficult to predict what versions of dependencies your users might need, you want to have a nice wide range of support. So generally, I mean, I've sort of personally found, and I haven't had a great deal of experience in this, but I've personally found it's easiest usually to pick a sort of lower bound of your support, And so, for example, let's just say we support Ruby 2.3 plus, right? And for a dependency library, let's just pick Active Record, and say we support Active Record 4.2 plus. So since we're putting all the effort into writing this gem, we want to give potential users the confidence that it's actually good enough for them to pull into their projects. So, I mean, because you could write the best library in the world, but it doesn't mean anything if no one actually uses it. And we want to demonstrate to potential users that our library is stable and does what it's supposed to do. So they're going to be asking things like, is it well maintained? Is the code of high quality? Things like that. And so the question we need to ask ourselves then is, what do we do in order to help answer these questions? And one of the things we do, of course, is to write tests. Of course, there's a bit of a problem. So the rub is that you, by writing this gem, need to support many versions of Ruby, but you also support many versions of, say, Active Record or any other dependency. And so the question is, how do you test against all these different combinations? Now, you're probably going to be using, I'm assuming, if you're using GitHub, which most of you will be, that you'll be using Travis or some other continuous integration type platform. I'm going to focus on Travis for this talk because that's what I use, but the ideas and points and stuff should be broadly applicable to all CI services. So with Travis, it's fairly straightforward to test against multiple versions of Ruby. You just, in your Travis YAML file, you can just add an RVM thing, and then you just basically start listing out the versions of Ruby that you want to test against. Now, the problem with this is that you end up with a nice little, you're testing against Ruby, go away. This thing is in the way, you can't see. But we're testing against Ruby, 2.3, 2.4, 5, and 6, but we are, you might have tests that are failing on 2.3 and 2.4, but it doesn't really tell you anything much about what's going on. What we really want is something like a test matrix, which is going to test our versions of Ruby against the different versions of our dependencies. And so now if we look at this table, you can see something like, okay, so clearly there's a problem with the Ruby 2.3, and there might be something weird going on with Ruby 2.4, here. But then of course we have to ask, how do we instruct our test runner to use these different versions of Active Record? And so I'm going to talk to you about one of my favorite gems. I know it's probably not as exciting as Nick's. But appraisal is something I discovered Now, appraisal is really interesting because it allows you to create as many different gem files as you need. So it's not just going to be going straight to your gem spec dependencies and loading the absolute latest version of your dependencies like you were originally. And actually, oops, I'll just quickly, no, come on, you can do it. So if we look at, basically with appraisal, it's fairly straightforward to use. You just create a file called appraisals, and then you call this appraise method and pass it a string just as an identifier, and then you pass it a block. And in your block, you list the different versions of the gems that you want to actually be testing against. Now, the way this works is that appraisal will then read your main gem file or your gem spec, and then it will override any of the versions you've put in your gem spec with what you've put in the block here. And so, of course, that means that it's going to override active record, the latest version, which is like 6 point something at this point, with, when it reads this, with 4.2.11. And then, of course, you're probably going to need some other things in here. This is just because I've got other dependencies. I really should delete that. And that sort of thing. But basically, you just write one of these blocks for every single one of these gems, every single one of the dependencies that you have. And then you run appraise, and it will just generate a whole bunch of gem files for you. And then after that, you need to tell Travis or your test runner like where these gem files are, what they're doing. So again, in Travis, this is fairly straightforward. Oops, hang on a second. Get rid of you. So in Travis, this is fairly straightforward. You can just give it a list of gem files, right? And so appraise by default puts all of the new gem files underneath in a folder called gem file. So you just list them all under there, and that gives you your test matrix. Now, all of this seems really great, except for the fact that development via Travis is a bit tedious in practice. So, you've got to change your file, commit your changes, upload it, wait for the job to build, then wait for the job to run. And so, it's annoying. And it would be much nicer if we could get some more immediate feedback. And so now we come to my personal favorite gem of the moment, which is What Would Travis Do? Which was written by a guy called Michael Grosser, who also works at Zendesk because it's great. Yeah, that's right. We're getting the plugs in, it's fine. And it's an excellent gem, and what it does is it just gives you instant feedback on what your Travis config is doing. And I'll give you a quick demo. Basically, you just, it just reads and parses your gem file and then just tries to do everything that's written in it. So you would do all the stuff that I'd written up before, and then if you just run What Would Travis Do, it will sit there and it will go through all of your things and run everything against all of the other stuff that you've got. Now, in order to make this work, you're obviously going to have all of the different versions of Ruby installed on your machine that it's expecting, right? And so you'll need to set up all your Ruby version management and stuff, but I'm assuming you've already done that. And then it'll just sit here and just go through all of them, which is, gosh, it's taking longer than I expected it to. Some of these tests are a little slow because the library, sadly, I couldn't mock all of it because otherwise I couldn't test all of the things. And you'll see when it eventually finishes that it will spit out a nice detailed table of what passed and exactly what conditions were run and all that sort of thing. And I really like this because it means that you can see your entire test suite run locally right now on your machine against every single different version of Ruby, against every different version of your dependencies. And you can also run all of your linting and all the other stuff in there as well. So yeah, it's really very nice. So, after doing that and actually running all this correctly, you might get a table output something along lines like this. But of course, we're still failing on Active Record 6 on Ruby 2.3 and 2.4, having fixed the bugs in our other 2.3 thing. So here comes the next little bit, is we can now start to remove unnecessary tests from the matrix because we don't just want this 2D table because some of the tests in this table are pointless, in particular the ones that are currently failing, because Active Record 6 doesn't support Ruby 2.3 or 2.4, so we don't actually want to run that. Travis allows you to exclude things. So, and you can see here, it's fairly straightforward. You just say in your matrix, we write exclude, and then you give it your Ruby version and the gem files and stuff not to run. So in this case, we're not running Active Record 6 gem file against Ruby 2.3, and we're not running it against Ruby 2.4. I also told it not to run Active Record 4.2 against Ruby 2.6 because honestly, if you're using Ruby 2.6, you're probably not using Active Record 4.2. Like, let's be realistic here. And you can also, as well as excluding things, you can also include things. So in this particular case, I'm just running a lint, I'm just making sure that all this stuff runs here, and I run linting against Ruby 2.3 because that's my, the target, like I need to support that plus. So yeah, it's well worth looking into their docs for all that sort of stuff. So of course, after doing that, you've got a table that looks like this, and it runs a little bit faster than it would otherwise. And you could probably be a bit more, you could probably prune a few more tests out of this, but I thought, Test Suite was probably fast enough anyway, so it was all right. So sort of to summarize and putting it all together, you should try and pick a range of dependency and your Ruby support. And then you can use Appraisal to set up your multiple gem files. And then Travis gives you multi-Ruby testing out of the box. And of course, what would Travis do allows fast and really easy development on all of this sort of stuff, which is just amazing. It's so much nicer. And then once you've got all of that working, then you would slim down your matrix to avoid a whole bunch of unnecessary testing and speed the whole thing up again. And that's really about it. I've got some resources up here if you want to take a shot of that screen. Does anyone have any questions?
Thank you for your talk. I wish you had given this talk a month ago. But
so what would you like to add to the talk then?
So one of the challenges that I found when I was doing basically this, except what would Travis do, was when you're depending on Rails, you have to make sure that your configurations of Rails are somehow a Frankenstein that are able to support multiple versions. Do you have any recommendations with respect to that?
No.
Thank you.
In a word, mostly because I haven't actually written anything that depends on the whole of Rails. It's usually like an Active Record or something along those lines. So no, I haven't come across that yet. Sorry. I wish I could help because it sounds painful.
Yeah. Good talk, Dave. Enjoyed that. Does Appraisal support other version managers other than RVM? I use ASDF, for example.
I'm actually using RBenv on this. It'll do whatever you want. I think the thing with Travis, right, is that it internally uses RVM. It doesn't really matter what version manager you use as long as it's got the versions available. I mean, Appraisal itself doesn't do any of the running. It just generates a bunch of gem files. And so then you've got to use your runner to actually do it. And so I think what would Travis do? I think it modifies the, there's a shell variable, environment variable asking for Ruby version. It just modifies that on the fly. So of course, if you don't have a particular version of Ruby installed, those tests will fail. But it'll keep running the suite, which is nice.
So I had all these questions a month ago as well. And I happened to be...
I wanted to do this talk in November, but they said no. I don't mean to throw anyone under the bus here.
But it turned out I also needed to depend on Rails as well. And just to answer that question, because he's too humble to answer it himself, Pat built a gem called Combustion, which builds a Rails for you inside your test suite, so you can have minimal stuff, only the stuff you need to test against in there to deal with that. And I used that, and it worked beautifully. So that, Combustion.
Sadly, I actually knew about Combustion, but I forgot you could do that with it.
But thank you, Pat.
Yeah, thanks, Pat. You're great.
That was cool. Thank you. So I had a couple of questions. One is, I guess, once you have the results of your test suite, do you have a process of going about like getting a faster iterative development on specifically what is broken?
Sorry, could you rephrase that? I'm not quite
As
sure what you're
in,
asking.
like, so you've run your whole test suite. You've
Yeah.
got a couple of, like, you know, say you've got a failure for like, you know, one configuration of the two things. So how would you go about then just like running just the tests that you know that failed for those specific?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure you can tell what would Travis do to run specific ones, or you can comment things out of your Travis YAML if you really want to. I haven't really come across a lot of that stuff because I also set up RuboCop to lint against Ruby 2.3. So if I used any you know, anything that's from later versions, it complains at me already. So like you're already kind of getting a lot of that stuff out. It's just, to be honest with you, a lot of this stuff is more about peace of mind than actually like finding real genuine failures. Like this niggly thing only works properly in this particular version. It's the sort of thing you may come across, but I mean, personally, I haven't. But my usual technique of just like narrowing down the cause by the, say, you know, commenting out this and that sort of thing would be what I would normally do. So no, nothing specific.
Cool. Yeah, that makes sense. And I think it kind of answers my other question, which was kind of around if your test suite gets quite like larger, you know, how, like, do you have any process that would involve like being able to run just the changed files or things like that?
Yeah, so I have a rake task that just runs a test suite against like my ordinary gem spec. But then I have another one called, you know, Rake CI, which just runs the whole thing. So it's a kind of like, for me, it's more of a, like if I'm working on the gem, I just run my normal test suite and I see that it passes. And then I go, well, before I faff around pushing this all to GitHub and stuff, let's just do a sanity check and run the complete integration test once rather than using that as a normal form of development process. Yeah, that's the way I use it because, you know, you don't want to sit there waiting for it to keep going all the time.
Yep, makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you. Not so much a question, I more just want to add something to the answer for Lauren and anyone else who's wondering it. With appraisal, you can, like, essentially you can run it and it'll run through each of the gem files as a command line tool. So you can say bundle exec appraisal rspec, and it will just run the rspec command for every gem file. But if you give it more arguments, then it'll run, say, rspec path to whatever. It'll run through each of your gem files for just that argument. I haven't used what would Travis do, but it wouldn't surprise me if it did that as well.
I'm pretty sure there's a lot of different options and stuff in there. You really have to look in through the documentation. I can't remember them all off the top of my head, so it's worth looking at the repos. Any other questions? No? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.